just until everyone leaves.
No. If I choose you, I won't pretend.
The Hall of Bonding had not seen a bride left unclaimed in 40 years. Tavira knew this because her mother had told her so, once, in a voice heavy with dread rather than pride. 40 years, Tavira? Do not be the one who breaks that streak. She had promised she wouldn't. She had believed, in the quiet optimism of youth, that beauty and grace might be enough to outweigh what her father had done. She understood now, standing beneath the vaulted crystal dome with its 1,000 floating lanterns, that she had been wrong. The great houses of Seravan filled the amphitheater in tiers of silk and polished horn jewelry, their vulpine ears twitching with anticipation, tails curled elegantly around ankles in the traditional posture of formal witness. 31 brides had stood on the dais tonight. 30 had already been claimed. Walked forward by proud, hopeful men who spoke the ancient words "I choose you," and no other before the entire assembly, sealing a bond that Seravan law considered as binding as blood. Tavira was the 31st. And she was alone. Her orange fur, groomed to a glossy sheen for the occasion, caught the lantern light in a way she once might have thought beautiful. Her mother had spent 3 hours braiding silver thread through the fur along her collarbone, the old velour pattern meant to draw the eye to a bride's grace. It had drawn eyes tonight, certainly. Hundreds of them. But none of the eyes belonged to men willing to cross the floor. Selvin, they were calling her under their breath. Traitor blood. Her father had spent his final years trying to expose a corruption ring inside the royal treasury. Nobles skimming colonial development funds meant for outposts that never got built. He had been right. He had also been thorough enough that 3 of the great houses lost fortunes and 1 lost its seat on the Concord Council entirely. He had died before they could arrest him, officially of a weakened heart. Unofficially, everyone in the room tonight understood exactly what that meant. And so his daughter stood beneath the lanterns while an entire civilization decided, in real time, that marrying her would cost more than her beauty could ever repay. The silence stretched. Somewhere above, a voice of ceremony, an ancient Vulpine woman whose office required her to narrate each choosing, cleared her throat awkwardly into her ceremonial staff microphone, unsure how to proceed. There was no protocol for this. No script for the moment. A bride simply remained. Tavira felt the tears rising and hated herself for it. Not here. Not in front of them. She had cried enough in private over the last year, for her father, for her mother's declining health, for the friends who no longer called. She would not give this room the satisfaction of watching traitor blood weep on the very stage built to celebrate her. She let her mind drift, the way it always did when the present became unbearable, back to the girl she had been only 2 years ago. A girl who had assumed, the way all sheltered daughters of prominent houses assume, that her future was a matter of gentle inevitability. She would be chosen by someone respectable. She would move into a comfortable estate. She would raise children who would learn stellar cartography at her knee the way she had learned it at her father's, and the great wheel of Seravan's aristocracy would simply continue turning, indifferent and eternal, with her folded safely into its mechanism. Her father had shattered that assumption with his own 2 hands, and she had never once, not for a single moment since, wished he hadn't. That was the cruelest part. She could not even resent him for it, because he had been right, and being right had cost him everything, and now it was costing her too, compounding interest paid out publicly under crystal lanterns while 300 people watched. She scanned the crowd once, desperately, uselessly, and that was when she saw him. Near the very back, half hidden by a support column and clearly uncomfortable in whatever ill-fitting formal jacket someone had loaned him, stood a human. Tall. Sandy-haired. A face that looked like it had spent more time squinting into starlight than at parties like this one. She recognized him immediately, and her heart lurched with something close to hope. Grant. She had met him only hours earlier, behind the palace kitchens, in the middle of the worst panic attack of her life. She'd fled the pre-ceremony preparations to breathe, found she couldn't, and ended up folded against the cargo crate hyperventilating into her own hands. He'd been unloading freight, Human pilots did the unglamorous supply runs the great houses considered beneath their own transport fleets, and he'd simply stopped. Crouched down. Didn't touch her, didn't ask her to explain herself, just talked to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The weather patterns on some Moon 3 systems over, the terrible coffee at the spaceport canteen, until her breathing slowed and the world stopped spinning. Thank you, she told him. Any time, he'd said, and meant it, and gone back to his crates without ever asking her name. He had no idea she was a bride tonight. He had wandered in, she realized now, probably drawn by curiosity or simple boredom while his cargo cleared customs, with absolutely no understanding of what he was witnessing. Which meant he was the only person in this entire hall who did not yet know to despise her. Something in Tavira, something reckless, something that had nothing left to lose, took over before her better judgment could stop it. She stepped down from the dais. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brides did not leave the dais, not ever, that was not how the choosing worked. She didn't care. She crossed the polished stone floor with her silver-threaded fur catching lantern light, and her heart hammering loud enough that she was certain he could hear it, and she reached him just as he blinked in confused alarm at the sudden attention of several hundred Vulpine nobles. "Please," she whispered close enough that only he could hear. "Please. Pretend you chose me." Grant looked at her. Really looked, the way he had that afternoon behind the kitchens, like he was trying to see past whatever performance was expected of her, and something in his expression shifted from confusion to a quiet, focused resolve. "Okay," he said simply. He didn't know the words. He didn't know the tradition, the weight of what he was about to do, the year of binding law he was about to invoke. He knew only that this woman had been standing alone under lights while a room full of strangers made her feel like something to be discarded, and he knew exactly, precisely, what that felt like. He took her trembling hand in his and walked her back toward the center of the hall. "I choose her," he said, loud and plain, into a silence so complete that his ordinary human voice rang out like a bell. "I don't know your ceremony. I don't know your rules. But if choosing her is what this is..." He looked at Tavira, not the crowd. "I choose her." The hall of bonding erupted. It took the voice of ceremony nearly a full minute to restore order, her staff microphone crackling with the amplified sound of her own stunned throat clearing. Nobles were on their feet. Someone near the front had actually fainted, a matron from House Kalenru, who would later insist the shock had been for Tavira's sake, though everyone present suspected it had rather more to do with propriety. "This is..." The voice of ceremony began, then stopped, then consulted a junior attendant who was already frantically scrolling through a data slate of ceremonial law. "This is unprecedented, but not," she said slowly, reading over the attendant's shoulder. "Not forbidden." A ripple of outrage from House Kalenru's tier. "He's not even Vulpine." "The law," the voice of ceremony read, raising her voice to carry, "as written by the founding Concord 800 years ago, states that any sapient being present and unbonded may step forward during the choosing and speak the words of claim. It does not specify species. It was written," she added, almost apologetically, "in an era when the founders wished to keep the ceremony open to allied peoples, in case of future alliance. No one anticipated." She gestured vaguely at Grant, who stood very still, aware he had become the single most scrutinized person in the star system and trying not to show how unnerving that was. "So it stands?" Someone called from the back, a younger noble who looked more delighted than scandalized by the chaos. "The claim stands." Other voices joined, some outraged, some, surprisingly, amused, as if the ancient and sometimes suffocating rigidity of the choosing had, for one night, cracked open to let in something genuinely unpredictable, and a portion of the crowd found that more entertaining than scandalous. A young noblewoman near the middle tier actually laughed aloud and clapped twice before catching herself under her sister's sharp elbow. The voice of ceremony looked, for a long moment, at Tavira. There was something almost sympathetic in her old eyes. She had known Tavira's father once, before his name became a thing spoken in lowered voices. She had, in fact, attended his own naming day feast decades ago, back when the Dorith name had meant something entirely different in this hall. "The claim stands," she confirmed. "By the old law, Tavira of House Saravin Dorith and Grant Mercer of—" She looked at him. "Earth," Grant supplied. "Wisconsin, if you need the whole address." A few nobles actually laughed, sharp and surprised, despite themselves. "Grant Mercer of Earth," the voice of ceremony continued, "are bonded from this night for one full cycle of Saravin's year. During that cycle they shall reside together, share hearth and provision, and at its conclusion either may petition for release without penalty, or the bond may be affirmed as permanent by mutual word." She struck her staff once against the stone floor, and the lanterns above flared gold. The traditional seal of a completed choosing. "It is done! It is done!" 2 words that undid everything Tavira thought she understood about her own future. She looked up at Grant. He was still holding her hand, she realized, hadn't let go once through the entire chaotic proceeding, and he looked down at her now with an expression that was mostly bewilderment, but not unkindness. "So," he said quietly, under the renewed roar of noble gossip breaking out around them, "I think I just got married. Was that what just happened?" "Yes," Tavira whispered. "Huh." He considered this. "Okay. You want to get out of here? Because I have never in my life felt this many people staring at me at once, and I once accidentally landed a cargo shuttle in the middle of a Titan colony parade. Despite everything. The humiliation, the shock, the impossible turn her evening had taken, Tavira felt something in her chest crack open into the smallest, most surprised laugh. "Yes," she said. "Please." They made it perhaps 10 steps toward the great doors before House Kalenra's matriarch intercepted them, her silks rustling with barely contained fury, 2 attendants trailing in her wake like storm clouds. She did not address Grant at all. Did not so much as glance at him, as though acknowledging him would grant his claim more legitimacy than she could stomach. "You understand," she said to Tavira, voice pitched low and venomous, "that this changes nothing. A human's word binds you legally. It does not launder your name. In a year, when this farce concludes, you will still be exactly what you were an hour ago." "Ma'am," Grant said pleasantly, before Tavira could summon a response, "I don't believe I caught your name." The matriarch's eyes flicked to him, contemptuous. "House Kalenra does not exchange names with hired transport." "Funny," Grant said, still pleasant, "because I could have sworn a name was exactly what your house was trying to protect a minute ago, hollering about how unprecedented all this was. Guess names matter right up until they're inconvenient." He offered Tavira his arm. "Come on. I think we've given these nice people enough of a show for one evening." The matriarch's mouth thinned to a bloodless line, but she said nothing further as they walked away, and Tavira found she was smiling despite everything, the first unguarded smile she'd managed in longer than she wanted to admit. Grant's ship was small, battered, and smelled faintly of engine coolant and reheated ration packs, nothing at all like the palace's incense-heavy corridors Tavira had grown up in. She stood in the narrow entry bay in her ceremonial silks, silver threads still glinting absurdly in her fur, and felt the full, exhausted weight of the night finally catch up to her. "It's not much," Grant said, watching her take it in with visible self-consciousness. "Wanderers do. Independent hauler. I run supply contracts between here and the outer colonies. Medical goods, mostly, sometimes grain shipments when the harvest routes get disrupted. It's not palace grade, but it's mine, and it's clean, and nobody's going to bother you here. It's kind. That you would..." Tavira stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "That you would ruin your life for a stranger. That you would help me." Grant leaned against a bulkhead, arms crossed, studying her with the same patient attention he'd shown her behind the palace kitchens. "You want to tell me what actually happened back there?" "Because I walked in on the tail end of it, and I've got about 40% of the picture." So she told him. All of it. Her father's investigation, his death, The disgrace that clung to her name like a physical stain, the choosing that was meant to secure her future and had instead confirmed, in front of the entire nobility of Saravan, that she was untouchable. She told it plainly, without asking for pity, bracing herself the way she'd learned to over the last year for the moment his expression would shift into something wary or regretful. It never came. "Your dad sounds like he did the right thing," Grant said instead, when she finished. "The hard kind of right thing. The kind that costs you. It cost him his life." "Yeah." Grant was quiet for a moment. "I had a commanding officer, back before I went independent. Guy caught the freight company running underdeclared cargo weights, cutting corners that were going to get a station crew killed eventually. He reported it. Got blacklisted so hard he couldn't get hired hauling garbage. Everybody who used to call him a friend suddenly didn't remember his name. He shrugged, but there was an old ache underneath it. People don't like being reminded that they let something bad happen right under their noses. Easier to be angry at the person who said so." Tavira looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself during the ceremony's chaos, and felt something in her carefully held composure loosen, just slightly. "You understand," she said, surprised. "I understand enough." Grant pushed off the bulkhead. "Look, I don't know the first thing about being married, Vulpine style or otherwise. But I know what it's like to walk into a room and watch people decide who you are before you've said a word. So here's what I figure. You take the cabin. I'll bunk in the crew quarters. Nobody's expecting anything from you here except, I don't know, existing. Figuring out what you want next. That sound okay?" It sounded, Tavira thought, like the first kind thing anyone outside her mother had offered her in over a year. "That sounds," she managed, "more than okay." He showed her the ship properly then. The cramped galley with its mismatched chairs, the cockpit with its worn leather seats, and the small collection of paper photographs taped along one console edge, his parents, she'd learn later, and a sister back on Earth, and one faded picture of a dog that had died before he'd left home, the cargo hold still half full of medical crates awaiting delivery to a colony 3 days out. It was nothing like the palace. It was, she began to realize somewhere in that first hour, considerably more honest than the palace had ever been. "There's a shower down that corridor, though I'll warn you the water pressure's an insult to the very concept of showering," Grant said. "And I can rustle up something to eat, though I'll be honest, my cooking skills top out around edible. Bosk usually handles anything that requires actual seasoning." "Bosk?" "Engineer. You'll meet him tomorrow. He's dead asleep right now, and God help the person who wakes him early." Grant hesitated, then added more gently, "You don't have to decide anything tonight. Eat something, sleep, and tomorrow we'll figure out the rest of it. All of it. Together, if that works for you." Tavira, who had spent the entire evening bracing for cruelty that never came, found she had no defenses left against simple decency. "Together," she echoed, testing the word, finding she liked the shape of it. "Yes. That works." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm Tavira had not expected to find comforting. The Wanderers ran a loop between 3 systems: Saravan, the mining colonies of the Asheville Belt, and the agricultural worlds clustered around the star the humans called Corvina. Grant hauled medical supplies outbound and raw ore or grain back, a modest but steady contract that kept the ship's small crew. Himself, an aging engineer named Bosk who communicated mostly in grunts and diagnostic readouts, and a rotating cast of dockworkers hired for loading, fed and fuel tanked. Bosk, when Tavira finally met him the next morning over a pot of scorched coffee, turned out to be a grizzled human of perhaps 60 with a mechanical left hand and an expression that suggested he had long ago run out of patience for anything that wasn't a working engine. He looked her up and down once, grunted something that might have been a greeting, and returned his full attention to a diagnostic panel without another word. "Don't take it personally," Grant murmured. "That's basically a warm welcome from him. He doesn't approve of me. He doesn't approve of anybody. He hasn't said a kind word to me in 4 years of working together, and I'm pretty sure he'd walk into vacuum for me without a second thought. Just give him time. He's not big on trusting people up front. Trust, for Bosk, is something you earn one competent decision at a time. Tavira had expected to feel like cargo herself. A complication Grant would tolerate for the length of the required year and then quietly release, the way one might a stray animal taken in during a storm. Instead, she found herself handed a datapad on their second morning together and asked, with genuine and slightly desperate hope, whether she knew anything about reading stellar charts. The NAV computer's fighting me on the Asheville approach, Grant admitted. Half the old beacon relays out that way got decommissioned after the last mining bust, and the automated systems don't account for gravitational drift from the belt properly. I've been flying half of it by memory and prayer. Tavira, who had spent her childhood curled in her father's study poring over antique star maps because they were quieter company than other children, took the datapad with something like hunger. She found the error within an hour. A decommissioned relay the system still waited as active, throwing every downstream calculation off by degrees that compounded dangerously across the belt's asteroid field. She corrected it, then kept going, restructuring the entire approach vector using older Vulpine stellar cartography methods that predated automated systems entirely, techniques taught to noble daughters as an elegant hobby, never expected to be useful. Grant stared at the corrected chart for a long moment after she handed it back. This would have saved me 4 hours and probably a hull scrape, he said. How do you know this? My father taught me. He said the old maps never lied to you the way politics did. A small, sad smile. Stars don't have agendas. Well, Grant looked at her with something new in his expression, not pity, not curiosity, but respect, plain and unadorned. Turns out I married a navigator. It became, without either of them quite deciding it, her place aboard the ship. She recalculated routes, caught errors the automated systems missed, found faster paths through debris fields that shaved hours off runs and, more than once, kept them clear of pirate patrols that favored the lazier, well-charted lanes. Bosk, who trusted almost no one, began leaving her his diagnostic reports unprompted, a wordless mark of approval that Grant assured her was rarer than a royal blessing. By the second month, he had started calling her Nav, instead of ignoring her entirely, which Grant informed her, with real solemnity, was the engineering equivalent of a knighthood. And Grant himself kept surprising her in smaller ways. He learned, clumsily and with several disastrous early attempts, how to prepare Velenrit stew, a Vulpine comfort dish her mother used to make. After finding her crying quietly over a ration bar one evening and asking, gently, what she actually missed eating. The first attempt had been nearly inedible, the root undercooked and the broth badly oversalted, and Tavira had laughed so hard through her tears that Grant had declared the exercise a qualified success regardless. The second attempt, a week later, had been genuinely good. By the fifth, it was better than some she'd had at noble tables. He never once asked her to perform gratitude for the arrangement, never treated her presence as a debt she owed him. When cargo runs took them through rowdier stations, he made a point of walking half a step ahead of her without being asked, not out of possessiveness but simple, unthinking protectiveness, the kind that expected nothing in return. You don't have to do that, she told him once, after he'd quietly steered her around a knot of drunk miners outside a Corvenna dockside bar. I know, Grant said. I want to. It was such a small thing to say. It undid her more than she expected it to. There were harder days too, days when the grief for her father surfaced unpredictably, triggered by a smell, a phrase, the particular slant of starlight through a viewport that reminded her of evenings in his study. On one such evening, 3 weeks into the bond, she'd locked herself in the cabin and simply cried, quietly and thoroughly, for nearly an hour, certain Grant would either ignore it or, worse, feel obligated to intrude with the kind of hollow comfort strangers offered. He did either. He knocked once, gently, and left a cup of tea outside the door. Steeped, she noted later, exactly 4 minutes, though she hadn't yet told him her preference, and could only assume he'd asked Bosk, who had somehow noticed, along with a folded note that read simply, "No need to talk if you don't want to. I'm just down the corridor if you do." She kept that note. She told herself it was sentiment, nothing more. She was not yet ready to examine what it actually was. 3 months into the bond, Tavira began keeping a private, unspoken tally of every moment Grant did something that made no sense if pity was truly his only motive. He remembered that she preferred her tea steeped exactly 4 minutes, not 5. He'd rerouted a run by half a day to avoid a system where slavers were known to operate near shipping lanes, without telling her he'd done it for her sake until Bosk mentioned it offhand. He'd started leaving the good reading lamp on in the cabin. Her cabin, the one he'd given up without complaint, angled just how she liked it, without ever being asked twice. He'd learned, without her teaching him, the small Vulpine gesture, ears angled slightly back, tail still, that signaled discomfort, and had started adjusting his own behavior around it before she ever had to ask. She told herself, repeatedly, that this was simply the kind of man he was. Decent to everyone. She had seen him overtip dock loaders who'd clearly had rough weeks, seen him spend an entire evening helping Bosk troubleshoot the engineer's ancient, failing hearing aid array without a hint of impatience. Kindness was simply his native language, and she was foolish to read anything more personal into receiving it. And yet, she caught herself, one evening in the galley, watching the particular way he frowned in concentration while patching a coolant line. The small furrow between his brows, the unconscious way he chewed the inside of his cheek, and felt something warm and frightening unfurl low in her chest. No, she told herself, sharply. Do not do this. He is being kind because he is a kind man. In 9 months this bond ends, and he will be relieved to have his ship, his cabin, his life back to himself. Do not mistake decency for devotion. But the thought kept returning, uninvited, at increasingly inconvenient moments. While watching him laugh at something Bosk grumbled, while listening to him hum some tuneless human melody while doing engine maintenance, while lying awake in the cabin that had once been his, achingly aware of him one thin bulkhead away. There was a night, docked at a quiet agricultural outpost around Corvena, when the ship's small common viewport offered an unusually clear view of the system's twin moons rising together, pale gold and silver, over the terraced fields below. Tavira had gone to watch alone, wrapped in a blanket against the recycled air's persistent chill, and found Grant already there, sitting on the floor with his back against the bulkhead, 2 mugs of something warm beside him. Couldn't sleep either, he said by way of explanation, and handed her one of the mugs without being asked. Figured I'd keep the moons company. She sat beside him. Closer than strict propriety would have once dictated, though propriety had come to feel like a distant country's customs rather than her own, and for a long while either of them spoke, simply watched the twin moons climb slowly through the dark. Can I ask you something? Grant said eventually. Of course. Back at the choosing. Before you came and found me, was there anyone you'd actually hoped might step forward? Someone you wanted? Tavira considered the question longer than it perhaps required, turning her mug slowly between her hands. There was a boy years ago, before the scandal. Renly Ashcourt. We were fond of each other, in the uncomplicated way children are fond of things. I used to imagine, foolishly, that he might be the one to claim me, when the time came. She shook her head. He married someone else, 6 months after my father's death. Sent no word. I don't blame him. His family would never have permitted it, after, but I used to wonder, sometimes, what it would have felt like, to be chosen by someone who'd known me before all of this. Before I became a name people whispered about. And now? She looked at him, at the moonlight catching in his hair, at the careful, unhurried patience he always seemed to carry with him like a second skin. Now I think, she said slowly, surprising herself with her own honesty, that being known after might matter more. Anyone can love the version of you that existed before disaster. It takes something else entirely to choose the version left standing after. Grant was quiet for a moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. For what it's worth, he said finally. The version left standing is pretty remarkable. She was not the only one, it turned out, keeping quiet track of small things. You get this look, Grant told her one night, over the remains of a dinner she taught him to make properly this time. The Velenrit stew, finally right, rich and warm and smelling exactly like her mother's kitchen. When you're working the charts, like the rest of the universe just goes quiet, and it's you and the stars having a conversation nobody else is invited to. Tavira looked up, startled. You've been watching me work? Hard not to. Grant said it simply, without embarrassment, the way he said most things. You're good at it. Really good. I don't think anybody back on Seravan ever bothered to notice that about you, did they? They were all too busy deciding what you weren't. Something in her throat tightened. No, she admitted. No one did. Well. He held her gaze steady and unhurried. I notice. She had no answer for that. None that wouldn't reveal far more than she was ready to say aloud. So she simply looked at him, across the small galley table, for one long moment that felt like it stretched the length of an entire star system, and let herself, just for that moment, hope. The letter arrived encrypted, routed through 6 relay stations to disguise its origin, delivered to Tavira's private data slate by a courier drone that vanished the instant it confirmed delivery. It was from Resende, an old colleague of her father's. One of the few who had not abandoned the family's name after the scandal. His message was brief, urgent, and terrifying. Tavira. Your father did not destroy the evidence before he died. I have reason to believe he hid it, encoded into something only you would think to look at, something with meaning only your family would understand. The nobles who ruined him know this too. They have been searching for it for over a year. If they find it first, it dies with him, and his name is never cleared. If you find it first, you can end them. Be careful. They have people watching for any sign that you remember what he taught you. R.D. Tavira read the message 3 times before the shape of it settled into place, cold and certain. Something only you would think to look at. She thought of her father's study. Of long evenings spent together over antique star charts while he explained, patiently, the old cartography methods no one bothered to teach anymore. Of one particular chart. A gift he'd given her on her 16th naming day, an ornate rendering of the Seravan home system done in the old hand-ink style, framed and hung in her childhood bedroom until the scandal broke and the family home was seized by creditors. The chart. She hadn't seen it in over a year. She had no idea if it even still existed. She found Grant in the cargo bay, running a manual inventory check with Bosk, and the look on her face must have telegraphed everything before she said a word, because he set down his data slate immediately. What happened? She showed him the message. Grant read it twice, his expression darkening with a focus she hadn't seen from him before, not the easy, unhurried patience she'd grown used to, but something harder, more alert. The look, she thought distantly, of a man doing rapid math on a threat. Okay, he said finally. Where's this chart now? I don't know. My family's estate was seized. Everything in it would have been auctioned or... She stopped. Or possibly kept in storage, pending the settlement of my father's debts. There's a records archive on Seravan. If it still exists, it would be logged there. Then that's where we're going. Grant was already moving toward the cockpit. Bosk, prep for a course change. Bosk, without looking up from the crate he was inventorying, said only, already on it. Heard the word archive and figured you'd be wanting Seravan coordinates inside the hour. He gave Tavira a brief, unreadable glance. Whatever it is you're chasing, Nav, hope it's worth the fuel. Grant. Tavira caught his sleeve. He stopped instantly, turning back to her with his full attention. This is dangerous. The people looking for this evidence killed my father, or as good as. If we go digging, we paint targets on ourselves. You already have a target on you, Grant said gently but without hesitation. Has been since the night I met you crying behind a crate of medical supplies. The only question is whether we let them keep aiming at you unanswered, or we give you a chance to fight back. He held her gaze. Your call. Whatever you decide, I'm not putting you on a shuttle back to Saravan alone and staying behind. That's not how this works. Not for us. Us. The word landed somewhere soft and unguarded in her chest. All right, she said. Saravan, then. They spent the 3-day transit preparing as best they could. Grant quietly reinforcing the ship's modest defenses with parts scavenged from a dock trader who owed him a favor, Bosk running diagnostics on systems that hadn't seen real use in years, Tavira poring over every fragment of her father's old notes she still possessed, trying to reconstruct what she could remember of his cartography ciphers before they even reached the archive. On the second night, unable to sleep, she found Grant in the cockpit, half illuminated by console light, running the same threat assessment for the 4th time. You should rest, she told him. So should you. He didn't look away from the console. Can't. Every time I close my eyes I run through the ways this could go wrong. She sat in the co-pilot's seat, an unfamiliar closeness that had become, over the months, entirely familiar. Why does this matter so much to you? My father's name. It's not your fight. Grant finally turned to look at her, and something in his expression was almost startled, as if the question itself didn't compute. Tavira. You are my fight. Have been since that first afternoon behind the kitchens, whether either of us called it that or not. He shook his head slowly. Your father's name matters because it matters to you. That's the whole equation. I don't need it to be more complicated than that. She didn't have a response for that. Not one she trusted herself to say aloud without giving away exactly how much those words had rearranged something inside her, so she simply reached over and rested her hand over his on the console, and they sat like that, together, until the transit clock finally counted down to arrival. The Saravan Records Archive occupied a squat, unglamorous building on the far edge of the capital, staffed by clerks who looked as though they had not seen an interesting request in decades. Tavira, wearing a plain traveling cloak with her distinctive fur braiding undone and hidden beneath a hood, approached the counter with a data slate bearing her family's estate case number while Grant hovered nearby, doing his best impression of an unremarkable human trader minding his own business. It took 2 hours of patient, careful navigation through bureaucracy before a clerk finally produced a storage manifest listing an ornate framed star chart, item 447C, currently held in a climate-controlled overflow warehouse pending final disposition of the Dorith estate. It took another hour to arrange a viewing. The warehouse itself was a maze of numbered shelving units stretching up into shadow, smelling of dust and preservation gel and the particular staleness of things left too long unclaimed. A tired attendant led them down aisle after aisle, checking numbers against her data slate, until she finally stopped before a shelf holding a single covered frame. Item 447C, she said, sliding it free with practiced indifference. You've got 20 minutes before I need this room for inventory. Sign here. The chart, when they finally stood before it in the dim storage room, looked exactly as Tavira remembered, the inked constellations of the Saravan home system rendered in her father's own careful hand, gold leaf tracing the major trade routes, her 16-year-old self's initials worked discreetly into one corner where he'd let her add her own mark. Seeing it again, after everything, nearly undid her composure entirely. She had to press her hand flat against the frame's edge and breathe for a moment before she could speak. Take your time, Grant said quietly, positioning himself between her and the door, watching the corridor beyond with an alertness that hadn't left him since they docked. She studied the chart for a long, silent moment. There, she breathed finally, tracing a cluster of stars near the chart's edge. This isn't a real formation. These stars. They don't exist in this configuration anywhere in the actual sky. He invented it. Her fingers moved with growing certainty over the false constellation, and understanding bloomed bright and sudden. It's a cipher. A star chart cipher, keyed to the old cartography conventions, the ones only someone trained the way he trained me would recognize as wrong. Can you read it? Tavira's hands were already moving, pulling free her own data slate, cross-referencing the false star positions against her father's old cartography notation system, a language of dots and vectors she had learned at his knee without ever once imagining it would someday save her life. It took 40 minutes, well past the attendant's stated deadline, though Grant managed to smooth that over with a combination of apology and a modest bribe that the attendant accepted with visible relief at not having to enforce her own rule. When the final string of decoded data resolved on Tavira's screen, financial ledgers, encrypted correspondence between 3 specific noble houses, timestamps and account transfers that painted an unmistakable, prosecutable picture of exactly how her father's investigation had been buried and his life quietly, deniably ended. Her hands were shaking too hard to hold the slate steady. Grant took it gently from her fingers, scanned the data, and his jaw tightened. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is everything." "This is everything," Tavira echoed, and for the first time in over a year, allowed herself to cry not from grief but from something dangerously close to hope. They stood there a moment longer, Grant's hand steady on her shoulder, before the practical urgency of the situation reasserted itself. "We need to get this off a single device," Grant said, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Copies, backups, something in a format that can't be easily wiped or seized. And we need to get back to the ship before anyone realizes what we just found." "You think someone's watching the archive?" "I think," Grant said grimly, "that a message told you people had been searching for this for a year, and you just spent 40 minutes decoding it in a public records building. I'd rather be paranoid and wrong than careless and dead." He was, as it turned out, not wrong to worry. They did not make it back to the Wanderer's Due before the offer came. A man in the muted gray livery of House Calendar was waiting at the spaceport, flanked by 2 silent attendants, when Grant and Tavira arrived at their docking berth. He introduced himself simply as Farron, an emissary, and asked with unsettling politeness for a private word with the human. Tavira wanted to refuse. Grant, reading the tension in her posture, squeezed her hand once and murmured, "5 minutes. I'm not going anywhere you can't see me." He was true to his word. The conversation happened in plain view on the docking platform, close enough that Tavira could watch every gesture even if she couldn't hear every word over the ambient noise of the spaceport. She watched Farron's expression, calm and calculating. Watched him produce a data slate, gesture toward numbers that made his attendants shift uncomfortably even at a distance, clearly a sum meant to be persuasive. Watched Grant's face remain, throughout, almost unnervingly still. She spent those minutes rehearsing, despite herself, the speech she would give when he came back and told her it was over. She would not beg. She would not cry, not in front of Farron's attendants, not where House Calendar could carry home stories of her weeping on a dock like some tragic heroine from a cheap opera. She would thank him, she decided, for the months of kindness, and she would let him go with whatever grace she had left, and she would find some way to survive the rest alone, the way she had always eventually had to. She was still assembling that speech, brick by careful brick, when Grant finally walked back to her, his expression unreadable, and every carefully prepared word evaporated the instant she saw his face. "What did he offer you?" "Permanent release from the bond," Grant said. "Effective immediately, no waiting for the year to complete. Full legal cover, official record would state the marriage never happened at all, some clerical annulment. Plus," he exhaled, "plus a number with more zeros than I've ever seen attached to my name in my life. Enough to buy a fleet, not just a ship. All I'd have to do is hand over you and whatever evidence you're carrying, and walk away clean." Tavira felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she stood perfectly still. "Here it is," said the small, wounded voice she had carried since the choosing. "The honorable exit. The reason that lets everyone forgive him for leaving. This is how it always goes. This is how you lose people, not through cruelty, but through the perfectly reasonable moment when staying stops making sense." "And?" she made herself ask, voice barely steady. "What did you tell him?" Grant looked at her. Really looked, the way he had on the night of the choosing, like he was seeing straight past every defense she'd built, and something in his expression was almost gentle with how obvious he found the answer. "I told him," Grant said, "that he could take his zeros and his fake annulment and shove them out the nearest airlock. Then I told him if his house comes near you again, he's going to find out exactly how creative a cargo pilot can get with an unlicensed ion cutter." A faint, humorless smile. I don't think he enjoyed that part of the conversation. Tavira stared at him, throat too tight to speak. "Tavira." Grant's voice softened. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. "You've been waiting this whole time for the moment I take the easy way out. I saw it happen just now. I watched you brace for it like you already knew how the story ends." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not that story. I never was. You asked me to pretend, once, back at that ceremony? I haven't been pretending in months. Grant, do you understand what you're turning down? That was a bribe from people who buried your father and tried to bury you right along with him," Grant said, quiet but immovable. "I don't want their money. I don't want out. I want—" He stopped himself, some restraint she'd never seen him exercise before, holding the rest of the sentence back, as though he'd decided this particular admission deserved better timing than a tense spaceport platform with hostile eyes potentially still watching. "I want to finish what we started. That's all. The rest we can figure out later. We're going to finish this," he said instead, gently but with absolute certainty. "We're going to clear your father's name, in front of everyone who watched you stand alone under those lights. And then—" he hesitated, just slightly, something unguarded crossing his face. "Then we'll figure out what comes after. Together. If you'll have me." Tavira, standing on a spaceport platform with her father's vindication in her hands and the man who had chosen her, truly chosen her, twice now, in ways that owed nothing to pity, looked up at Grant Mercer and felt the last of her carefully guarded fear finally, quietly, let go. "Together," she agreed. That night, back aboard the Wanderer's due and finally clear of Saravin's crowded space lanes, Bosk found her alone in the galley, staring at nothing in particular over a cup of untouched tea. "He turned it down," Bosk said. "Not a question." "Yes. Figured he would." The old engineer settled into the chair across from her with a grunt, studying her with an expression she'd never quite seen from him before, something almost gentle beneath the customary gruffness. "For years I've known that man. He doesn't take the easy road. Never has. Watched him turn down better contracts than what Kalenra offered because the client wanted him hauling something that smelled wrong. He's stubborn about doing right, is what he is. Costly kind of stubborn." He paused. "You could do worse, Nav. For what it's worth. Which isn't much, coming from an old man who talks to engines more than people." It was, Tavira thought, possibly the longest sentence Bosk had spoken in her presence in 3 months, and possibly the kindest. "Thank you, Bosk." He grunted again, clearly finished with sentiment for the evening, and shuffled off toward the engine room, leaving Tavira alone with her tea and the quiet, steady certainty settling into her chest that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The Hall of Bonding had never, in its 800-year history, hosted a choosing ceremony as spectator event rather than participant ritual. But when word spread that the human who had claimed the disgraced Dorith daughter a year prior intended to return on the anniversary of that very ceremony, half of Saravin's nobility found urgent reason to attend the following year's rites regardless of whether they had brides or grooms among the candidates. The rumor had traveled fast in the preceding weeks. First as gossip among dockworkers who'd overheard fragments at the spaceport, then through noble channels always hungry for scandal, until by the night of the ceremony itself, the hall was packed well beyond its usual capacity, extra seating hastily arranged along the upper tiers, the air thick with anticipation that had nothing to do with the current year's brides at all. Tavira stood near the back of the crowded hall, exactly where Grant had once stood. The symmetry was not lost on her. And watched the current year's brides take the dais, watched houses step forward one by one to claim them beneath the same drifting lanterns that had once watched her stand alone. She recognized several faces in the crowd from a year ago. Some looked at her now with open curiosity, a few with something that might almost have been apology, though none quite met her eyes long enough to confirm it. When the final bride had been claimed and a murmur of anticipation began rippling through the crowd, everyone present knew, by now, why they had truly come. Grant took her hand. "Ready?" "No," Tavira admitted, and found she was smiling despite the nerves twisting through her. "Let's do it anyway." They walked to the center of the hall together, and the voice of ceremony, the same old Vulpine woman from a year before, watching now with something that looked suspiciously like fondness, struck her staff once for order. "Grant Mercer of Earth," Tavira said, loud enough to carry to the farthest tiers, "requests the floor to speak before this house on a matter concerning House Dorith." A ripple of tension. House Calenra's tier, she noted with grim satisfaction, had gone very still. Grant stepped forward, unhurried, and when he spoke his voice was steady in a way that filled the enormous silent hall without any need for amplification. "A year ago, I stood where I'm standing now and made a promise to a woman I'd known for exactly one afternoon," he said. "I didn't know your customs. I didn't know your politics. I knew that she'd been left alone by people who decided who she was before they ever bothered to ask." He looked around the hall, slow and deliberate, meeting eyes that had once refused to meet Tavira's. "Since then, I've learned a few things. About navigation. About stellar cartography. About the difference between people who claim honor and people who actually have it." He gestured, and Tavira stepped forward beside him, activating the data slate that projected, in bright, undeniable light across the hall's central column, the decoded evidence from her father's chart. Financial transfers. Correspondence. Names. Gasps, then furious murmuring, then, from House Calenra's tier, the sharp scrape of chairs as several nobles rose in alarm. "Tavira's father," Grant continued, over the rising noise, "exposed corruption that 3 of your great houses spent a year and a considerable fortune trying to bury, along with his reputation, and very nearly his daughter's life. He died before he could finish what he started. She finished it for him." He turned briefly, to look at her, pride plain and unguarded on his face. House Dorothy's name was never disgraced. It was silenced. Tonight, it isn't silent anymore. Farron, House Calenra's emissary, had gone pale in the frontier, already exchanging urgent, hissed words with the matriarch beside him. Elsewhere in the crowd, Tavira caught sight of faces she recognized from her childhood, old family friends who had quietly disappeared after her father's death, now staring at the projected evidence with expressions of dawning, uncomfortable understanding. The voice of ceremony, staff trembling slightly in her old hands, raised it high for order, though it took several long minutes before the hall's uproar settled enough for her voice to carry. "The Concord Council will require full review of this evidence," she announced finally. "But by the authority of this office, I declare House Dorothy's name cleared of all prior charge, pending formal proceeding against the houses named herein." Her gaze found Tavira across the hall, and something warm passed briefly across her ancient face. "Your father would be proud, child." Tavira, tears finally slipping free, not from grief this time, not from humiliation, but from something vast and overdue, felt Grant's hand find hers. "There's one more thing," Tavira said, her voice carrying despite its unsteadiness. She turned to face him fully, aware of the entire hall watching, and found she no longer cared. "Our year is over, Grant. As of tonight, the bond's requirement is complete. You don't have to pretend anymore. You're free." Grant looked at her for a long moment, and the hall, sensing, perhaps, that this was the part of the evening that mattered more than politics, fell into an entirely different kind of silence. "You know," he said, "I never actually was pretending. Not after the first week, honestly. But you're right that I don't have to say anything else tonight." He took her other hand, so that he held both now, steady and warm. "So let me say it because I want to, not because any law says I have to. He knelt, right there on the polished stone floor of the Hall of Bonding, in front of the same crowd that had once watched Tavira stand alone. The first time, I chose you because you needed someone, and I couldn't stand watching you stand there without one, Grant said. This time, I'm choosing you because I love you. Because you're the smartest person I've ever watched work a star chart, and the kindest person I've ever shared a ship with, and because somewhere in the last year you stopped being the woman I helped and became the reason I look forward to every single sunrise, on every planet we ever visit. He drew a slow breath. I choose you, Tavira Dorith. Not out of pity. Not out of law. Because I love you, and I want to keep choosing you, every single day, for as long as you'll let me. The Hall of Bonding, for the second time in exactly 1 year, erupted, not in scandalized whispers this time, but in something closer to a roar, as even the assembled nobility of Saravan found themselves swept up in the sheer, undeniable romance of it. Somewhere in the upper tiers, Tavira thought she saw the same young noblewoman who'd clapped a year ago now openly cheering, no elbow this time to silence her. Tavira, laughing and crying in equal measure, pulled Grant back to his feet and answered him the only way that felt true. I choose you too, she said. I have, for months. I was just too afraid to say it first. Well, Grant said, grinning as he pulled her close beneath the drifting golden lanterns. Good thing one of us finally worked up the nerve. The weeks following the second choosing were, Tavira reflected, nothing at all like the chaos of the first. And everything like it, in the ways that mattered most. The Concord Council's investigation moved with the particular sluggishness of institutions forced to confront their own failures, but it moved. Farron was recalled from Saravan within days, and House Kalenra's matriarch, once so contemptuous on that spaceport platform, found herself instead the subject of a formal inquiry, her house's holdings frozen pending review. 2 of the other implicated families fared no better. Justice, Tavira learned, rarely arrived as swiftly or as completely as one hoped, but it arrived, and that was more than she had allowed herself to expect in over a year of quiet grief. Her mother, whose health had declined under the accumulated weight of disgrace and worry, wept for a solid hour when Tavira brought her the news in person, then spent the next several visits interrogating Grant with the particular thoroughness of a woman determined to approve of her daughter's choice on the merits rather than the desperation that had originally produced it. You could have taken the money, she told him bluntly, over tea in the modest room she now occupied on Saravan's outer district. Everyone would have understood. No one would have thought less of you for it. I would have thought less of me, Grant said simply, and Tavira watched her mother's stern expression finally, fully soften. Well, her mother said. I suppose that settles that, then. Life aboard the Wanderer's Dew resumed its familiar rhythm, though everything about it felt subtly, wonderfully different now that pretense had been fully set aside. Bosk, to no one's genuine surprise, took credit for the entire romance at every opportunity, informing anyone who'd listen at the various ports they visited that he'd seen it coming since week 2, obviously. A claim Grant disputed loudly and Tavira found herself disinclined to argue with, since it was, in fact, probably true. They were married again 3 months later, properly, this time, with no urgency and no law compelling either of them, only the simple, chosen wish to stand before their gathered friends and declare what had already become true in every way that mattered. Bosk gave an uncharacteristically long toast, mostly grumbled, that somehow still managed to make half the room tear up, ending with the gruff observation that he'd never met 2 people more stubborn about doing right by each other, and frankly it was exhausting to watch unfold, but he supposed that was the point. The voice of ceremony, retired now but insistent on attending, presided over the vows herself, remarking afterward that in 800 years of service, it was the first choosing she'd ever seen completed twice, and the only one, she said, that had ever gotten it right both times. Tavira kept navigating. The Wanderer's Dew expanded its routes, in time, into something larger. Not because either of them craved wealth, but because word traveled fast about the navigator who could read old star cipher charts better than any automated system, and about the pilot who'd once knelt before Saravin's entire nobility to choose a bride the whole world had once discarded. New contracts came in steadily enough that Grant eventually brought on a second small vessel and a young Vulpine dockhand named Corin who reminded Tavira, in small unguarded moments, of who she might have been if her life had never been derailed, and who she made a quiet, private point of mentoring, of teaching the old cartography methods to, of ensuring that at least one more young woman on the margins of Saravin's rigid hierarchy would never again feel as unseen as she once had. On quiet evenings, drifting between systems with the ship's running lights dimmed and the galley smelling faintly of Velenrit stew, Tavira would sometimes catch Grant watching her work the charts the way he had that very first month, that same soft, unhidden warmth in his eyes, as if he still couldn't quite believe his luck. "What?" she'd ask, every time, though she always already knew. "Nothing," he'd say, every time, though he never once meant it. "Just choosing you again. Figured I'd let you know." And beneath the endless, patient stars that had first taught her the language of belonging, Tavira would smile, and take his hand, and choose him right back.